So while they're coming to the stage, let me introduce the session. So ESG, it's the prism through which big business is and will continue to make strategic decisions about its operations. It's the topic that's being discussed around family dinner tables the world over. It's the success of our current and our future generation of leaders will be defined by their ability to support and to implement ESG initiatives. With most of the developed and more of the developed and undeveloped minerals in any other place in the world, the strive towards ESG disproportionately impacts the mining sector in Africa. As a region and as a sector, you are being asked to tackle this global imperative without necessarily having the runway that the global north has benefited from. For you in Africa, the ESG transition presents unique challenges, but it also presents significant opportunities. Here in Western Australia, we've got a lot to contribute to the ESG journey in Africa with an established and a growing track record on how best to capitalise on considerable mineral wealth whilst meeting and exceeding social and environmental expectations. In recent times at DLA Piper, we've received more inquiries about ESG initiatives and imperatives than any other, whether it's helping to clarify corporate purpose, establishing integrated ESG initiatives to drive progress, appropriately managing and mitigating risk through reporting and governance and through the use of data and technology, whether it's addressing social issues from diversity through to inclusion, through to basic human rights, navigating a transition to low carbon and biodiverse economies, designing and implementing change management through to supply chain integrity and everything in between. We help clients transition to and thrive in a more sustainable future. Our challenge, and indeed the challenge for all of us, is to support and to accelerate that progress. And it's why DLA Piper is delighted today to present a panel discussion that will consider the topic, a best fit and a collaborative approach to ESG is key to achieving a just energy transition in Africa, using as a case study transition critical minerals, specifically battery minerals. The panel will be moderated by DLA Piper's Jean-Pierre Douglas Henry, a regulatory, compliance and disputes partner with more than 30 years' experience advising clients in more than 45 countries, including Africa. Heralding originally from Port Hedland here in WA, JP is an Australian in London who is today DLA Piper's Managing Director for Sustainability and Resilience, where he is responsible for ESG, innovation and resilience. Please welcome JP.
Thank you, Alison. I'm conscious that I stand together with my esteemed panel between you and lunch. So we're going to have a lively discussion that will sharpen your appetites and prepare you for that eventuality. Thank you for attending. Good afternoon, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. Today, we're joined by 5 very knowledgeable and experienced panelists. I'm going to introduce them briefly and then make a few opening remarks before going into open session. First, I'm delighted to welcome the Honourable Samuel Abu Jinapor, the Ghanaian Minister for Mines and Natural Resources, a member of the New Patriotic Party and a member of Parliament for the Domongo constituency of the Savannah region. Honourable Minister, thank you for joining the panel. Mr. Hubert Danso, on my left, the CEO and Chairman of Africa Investor Group and Chairman of the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank, together with a whole bunch of other roles that really place him ideally to talk about financing and investment in the ESG context. Further down the panel, second from the end, Mr. Terence Dambe is the Managing Partner and Head of the Real Estate Division of Minchin & Kelly in Botswana and has a strong partnership and relationship with DLA Piper. Welcome, Terence. Terence's practice includes energy and natural resources and real estate, and he's advised on some of the biggest energy and mining projects in Botswana and the surrounding region. Tracking back next to the Honourable Minister is Mr. Jordan Morrissey, the Executive General Manager of Sustainability at Resolute Mining, who we've heard a little bit about in the conference to date, an African-focused gold miner with some really exciting projects in Mali and Senegal. Welcome, Jordan. And last but not least, stepping in for Mr. Ikal Taylor is Mr. Mark Atadanso, the Chairman of the Stakeholder Engagement Committee of the African Mining Professional Association of Australia. Now, before we proceed, I'm just going to set the scene for you. ESG has become such a prominent topic globally that it is now at the top of the list of priorities for just about every government and every major company in the world. These environmental, social and governance-related issues are non-financial factors that must be taken into account by governments when they make policy and by companies when they make decisions in today's modern world. It's such a broad topic. It spans diversity and inclusion issues, human rights, corruption, governance issues, data and data ethics, as well as climate change and nature or biodiversity loss. Today, though, we're going to focus primarily on the climate-related issues and how they relate to mining, which contributes more than 10% of global emissions, and in particular on mining in Africa. Before we do that, some important context. Despite what Donald Trump says, even the scientists now agree that temperatures are increasing because of greenhouse gas emissions. And in the words of the Secretary General of the United Nations, this is a code red for humanity. We simply must reduce our emissions, and we must do so quickly. At the current rates of emissions reduction, Senator Kerry, President Biden's climate envoy, says we're headed for almost 3 degrees of warming. Now remember, the Paris Agreement was 2 degrees or less, ideally 1.5. Senator Kerry is saying 3 degrees. That will result in more extreme weather events, more fires, more droughts, more floods, and get this, ladies and gentlemen, the United Nations estimates 1.2 billion climate refugees by 2050, and I'm sorry to say, a lot of them in the African continent. Now, I'm sure everyone in the room is aware of the Paris Agreement, signed by over 193 countries, and the subsequent COP meetings, which have focused on keeping the planet from heating up above 1.5 degrees of pre-industrial revolution temperatures. The next COP, COP27, is being held in Africa, in Egypt, in a couple of months' time. Now, at this COP, your COP, it's anticipated that there will be more discussion than ever before about how the developed world can help the global south, including Africa, transition. And there will be a keen focus, more than ever, on how we make that a just transition. And the reason for that, ladies and gentlemen, is simple. Many parts of Africa are partway through, or they're just about to start their industrial revolution. And despite the fact that Africa is only responsible for 2% of global emissions, 2%, the world is asking you not to follow the same path as the global north did, where they used oil, coal, and steel, and other high-emitting substances and activities for their revolution. But they're asking you to have a green industrial revolution. And this is despite the fact that China generates 23%, the US 18%, and the EU 13% of emissions, compared to your 2% in Africa. And because Africa's rich in minerals, you're being asked to transition and mine those minerals in a sustainable way. using clean or renewable energy sources and practices, and you're being asked to do that to avoid jeopardizing the emissions reductions of the global north, the biggest emitters, I've just named them, and the wider world. There's no point in that group reducing their emissions only to have them replaced by another industrial revolution which goes the same way as ours did. But, and this is the rub, many of the mineral-rich countries of the world, including in particular Africa, do not have the infrastructure yet to enable the transition to renewable energy sources at the speed and scale needed, nor is the capital available yet, and in some cases, nor is the technology yet, but it's coming. And the transition could, in the meantime, put local jobs at risk and communities at peril unless there are viable opportunities to the status quo put in place first. The difficulty with that is that we don't have the luxury of time to do all of these things to the nth degree or to wait to see what happens. And this is nowhere more evident than in the case of transition critical minerals which are dotted across Africa. These are the minerals which are needed to power the rest of the world's transition to renewable energy. Most obviously, those used in the manufacture of batteries. They're key to electrification and the storage and transmission of clean energy. To put this in context, the World Bank predicts that the production of graphite, lithium, and cobalt will need to increase by a whopping 450% by 2050. And that's just a small selection of the critical minerals we're talking about. But it's going to take time for the private sector and for governments, even with the best will in the world, to collaborate to create the infrastructure for renewable energy to power sustainable mining of these critical minerals, and to have the right investors and legal frameworks in place, and to make sure that that sustainable mining benefits the communities in which it takes place rather than penalising them. So central to today's panel discussion is how we do this with respect to transition critical minerals. And do we have time to wait so that we can mine them sustainably, or, as the title to the session suggests, should we adopt a best fit approach and do the best we can for now in ESG terms, accepting that some fossil fuels will be used to mine these minerals while we transition to renewables, and in the meantime, we, you, do all the other things we need to do in collaboration with governments, investors, local communities, and NGOs to make this more sustainable? That's a difficult question, and I'm going to let it sit with you and ask you to think about it, and hopefully it'll provoke some questions while we run through a number of the issues associated with the mining of critical minerals, and that's my segue into asking our esteemed panel to take some questions and to kickstart a discussion about this topic. And I want to start with the Right Honourable Minister. How big is the opportunity here for Africa or African countries with these minerals, and what do you think, Minister, the biggest challenges are? And is this just about getting a mine built, or is there an opportunity to procure these projects with aligned industries like battery recycling plants, EV investment? And we've heard a little bit about this earlier in the conference. Be very interested in your views.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be on this panel and the question, which quite clearly is a very consequential question, a very important question. A direct answer to it, in some respect, will be the new paradigm that I believe most African countries, and Ghana in particular, are seeking to pursue in terms of the exploitation of our mineral resources, whether the traditional ones, the known ones as gold, bauxite, diamond, or the minerals which have been classified as the minerals of the future, lithium, cobalt, phosphate, and the rest. And that paradigm, if I may use Ghana as a case study, which has been widely articulated by our president, is to have a different set of arrangements in terms of the management and exploitation of the mineral resources of our country, which will mean that we'll retain the full value chain in our country. Retain the full value chain being that from exploration to mining to production to refining to the downstream industry. All of those are planted in Ghana. And there's been a gamut of policy, legislative, regulatory framework which have been put in place to make sure that happens. But yes, you are right. The conundrum between resolving the conundrum in exploiting these minerals and at the same time adhering to the principles of ESGs is a very important one, it's a very delicate one. And there's no straightforward path to dealing with that. I mean, I think in all the extractive industries in the world, whether the petrochemical, the mining industry, striking that balance of leveraging and exploiting these resources, exploiting them we should, no two ways about that, to bring about the needed development, but at the same time, also protecting the environment and making sure that the exploitation is sustainable is important. In Ghana, we've made some tremendous move in that. I mean, as you may be aware, Ghana is the first country in the world to have applied the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative principles to the mining industry. I mean, it's been done for the petrochemical industry, but not for the mining. Yeah. Ghana is one of the first. And of course, as a member, as a party to the Minamata Convention, we have taken a step further in trying to eradicate the use of mercury in artisanal mining in our country. So is it also that reclamation bonds are a prerequisite for large-scale mining. And in fact, we've even gone a step further to say that artisanal miners will have to reclaim lands which they mined on concurrently. In other words, they have to reclaim them as they go. And you know, the gamut of measures we put in place. We've banned, for instance, prospecting in forest reserves, recognizance in forest reserves in the small-scale mining industry. And so we have a whole regime and a very robust, high-standard ESG adherence to the principles of ESGs, which we believe is helping. But I think it's important that as we have this conversation about climate change and the role of mining and generally the activity, human activities generally and its impact on the climate, it's important that we are frontal about some of the issues on the table. The Paris Agreement, which was executed in 2015 in Paris, as you've rightly pointed out, which sets 1.5 degrees Celsius as a target, is one that we have to recognize the historical and contemporary dynamics relating to the global fight against climate change. As you pointed out, Africa contributes 2% of carbon emissions. China contributes 23%. The United States does a significant one. Europe does a significant one. The question you posed to me as a minister from an African country, a policymaker, in terms of what we will do to contribute to the global fight against climate change, to some extent, inherently, we would say a bit unequitable, because you have the Western world, and I don't say this with any disrespect, socially have been, so that they unleash the prosperity that they've unleashed today, employing coal, industrial revolution from the 16th century all the way through, which build the roads, build the infrastructure of the Western world, and which has contributed to unleashing unprecedented prosperity for its masses and its people. The African people today are making that same effort, making that same attempt, but we're having all these hurdles along the way. I don't suggest in the least that some of the requirements or some of the standards we are being asked to live up to are not tenable or are not noble. All of those are welcome. But they must be in a context of a recognition of the historical imbalances and injustices, which will require that the whole framework will take into account the peculiarity of the African situation, and if I may say, the peculiarity of the Ghanaian situation. Let me conclude by just giving one example. In Paris in 2015, the developed world pledged $100 billion United States dollars to support Africa in what we call adaptation. Because as you talk about climate change, there are a lot of practices in the communities, in the villages, in the rural parts of Africa, which are being jettisoned, which are being asked to be jettisoned. I mean, people can no longer engage in farming in a manner that they used to do 10, 20 years ago because of climate change. And this fund was supposed to cushion these suffering, farming people in Africa and other places, and also generally cushion Africa in its contribution towards the fight against climate change. That has not been met. That has not been honored.
I was going to ask you, Minister, how much of that pledge have you seen delivered?
Well, very little, not much. But fundamentally, the fundamental point I make is that it requires collective action, but collective action which is anchored on equity, which is anchored on the recognition of the historical imbalances, and also the need, for example, for Ghana to exploit its lithium, for Ghana to exploit its phosphate, and for Ghana to exploit its bauxite. Because we need to do that to be able to achieve the development that we yearn for, which many parts of the world have already achieved. And in doing so, particularly the green transition, which is the transition from fossil fuel to battery-driven vehicles, automobiles, all of those will contribute to the fight against climate change. But we must do so intelligently, we must do so constructively. And I'll give you one final example. In Ghana, for example, we are seeking to build an integrated aluminum industry in Ghana. Yeah. And the president of our country, as I said earlier, has insisted that we keep the value in Ghana. And therefore, we've established by an act of parliament a corporation which is the bureaucracy to oversee the development of this integrated aluminum industry, which is called the Ghana Integrated Aluminum Development Corporation, GIADEC. There is actually a whole green desk in that corporation to ensure that in exploiting these minerals, we do so sustainably, we do so with regard to environmental sustainability. So all of those are being done. And I should just conclude by saying that in Ghana, we are very conscious of ESGs. We're very conscious of climate change. Our commitment is total and unflinching. And as you know, Ghana is a very democratic country, big civil society organizations. Some of the voices in Ghana promoting the fight against climate change and so on and so forth are as vociferous as you can find anywhere in the world. But ultimately, when all is said and done, our position is that exploiting these minerals we should, and we intend to do so, but we do so with firm and religious commitment to protecting our environment and sustainability. That is the policy of the Ghanaian government. Thank you very much.
Can I just add there, just to support the minister? I think this issue of equity and equitability is a very critical one. And Minister, as we begin to look and understand the types of resources that we need and the sort of equitable financing bridge, I think we should also continue to focus on the math. Because I think according to the PwC report, the adaptation needs are significantly greater than the 100 billion on the first point. The second point is that the 100 billion that is a vintage old promise that hasn't been met is not only for Africa, it's for all emerging markets and developing countries. And then when you sort of correspond that back to the actual audit that was done on Africa's reserves for fossil fuels, for example, it's $15.2 trillion as at November 26th last year. So the intermediating sort of equitable trade-off compensation being $100 billion, which is not even for the entire continent, throws it into a very different light and a very different perspective. And I think there's a new negotiation that one may need to have at COP27 in that respect.
I was just going to say that. So we were legal advisors to the UK government as president of COP26, and many of you will have been there and you'll recall the conversations about reparation, about adaptation, about the 100 billion. And there were lots of good things done at COP26, but that conversation, depending on your point of view, was either shut down or petered out towards the end and didn't really come to a conclusion. Prediction, at COP27, your COP, the African COP, that topic is going to be at the forefront of everyone's minds. It's going to be about implementation, adaptation, and how do we pay for this? And if we come back to the question I asked somewhat mischievously, how much of that pledge have you seen delivered on, the 100 billion? Well, we've got 8.6 billion committed in South Africa for decarbonisation. That's a start, and a good start. But we need to do a lot more of that. The problem is, behind all of these government pledges lies geopolitics, and you just need to look at what's happening in Russia and Ukraine to see the complexity of some of these issues. Key question, and it's the reason we're all here, what's the role of the private sector in this? And Hubert, you mentioned the opportunity, the commercial opportunity here. There are lots of challenges, but there's also a huge commercial opportunity. So Hubert, can I come back to you and ask you, as chair of the Africa Green Infrastructure Bank, what's the appetite for investing in and financing the mining of these transition critical minerals? Put simply, is there enough private capital out there to plug the government gap pending further COPs where we come to a landing on the 100 billion and all the rest of it, because 100 billion isn't going to be enough?
Yeah, no, great question, JP. I think it's well established that, we have to think about the whole market from a very different perspective. I think the private sector has not necessarily come to the party sufficiently well in terms of the role that our pension funds and our sovereign wealth funds and our institutional capital base can play. But, we look at it in terms of the nationally determined contribution projects, which I think were estimated in the region of about $3 trillion required by 2030. And then when you put that into context, the entire world only mobilized $2.8 trillion for renewable energy investments between the year 2000 and the year 2020. So that's 20 years. So we're actually being asked to mobilize more investment and capital for Africa in the next 8 years than the entire world has been able to mobilize in the last 20 years. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not possible, but it means that we're going to have to make some very structural and fundamental adaptions, and that means we're going to have to start developing new perspectives about scale. How do we mobilize capital at scale? Historically, we've been very much a development project in some respects, unfortunately. We haven't really been as private capital friendly or as absorbative as we could be. But I think for this climate challenge, the investment community, we're really coming to the party. We came together in partnership with heads of state and the African Union to establish the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank as what is known as an institutional investor-public partnership, so we can mobilize capital at scale and work with governments to create a legal and enabling environment to be able to deploy that capital at speed. So there's definitely a willing, I think the capital is there, but I think we really need to work more collaboratively with the minister and a number of other key policy makers that get it. Ghana absolutely gets it, in terms of forming partnerships between large pools of capital, strategic investment platforms. Ghana's done it in the mining sector already. We have one of our institutional partners, the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund, is investing in the gold sector in Ghana. That's the type of leadership that gives the private sector confidence that there's an alignment of interest around these particular assets. But I think one of the things that we should also note is that in terms of this particular partnership, we might need to take a little bit of a different perspective in terms of how do we characterize the opportunity, how do we recognize the sense of urgency. So if you look at the continent, only 50% of the continent has been geologically tested. And a lot of the research in the market suggests that there's at least the same amount of resource that's unexplored than we have that's proven. But then you correspond that back to the last week's statement from the IEA, and they back this up with numbers, where they said there are two fundamental issues around transition critical minerals. The first is that we're not mining them quickly enough. Yep. So we're going to have to, really accelerate that particular process. But the second thing, which is quite staggering in some respects, as we look to try to increase our allocations to this, is that they're basically saying that for the next 25 years, the next generation of the transition away from fossil fuels, we are suboptimal in many respects. So for example, copper. We only have 20% of the required copper for the next 20 years of transition. We have 3.48% of the required cobalt, 3.57% of the required graphite, 10% of the required lithium, 10% of the required nickel, and 3.52% of the required vanadium.
I think what you're saying is we've got to get on with it.
I'm saying that we need to grow the pie.
We need to grow the pie.
Not the slice.
Right.
So we actually need to think about the other 50% of the ungeologically tested. How can we accelerate partnerships that are very aligned between governments, institutional capital, through institutional investor-public partnerships that are very similar to the ones used in Australia?
And two things come out of that.
Yes.
One is the capital's there.
Absolutely.
Right. Two, if you got the money, you need the legal and regulatory frameworks in place to enable delivery of the money into projects. Terence, be interested in your view about whether we have the legal and regulatory frameworks in place across Africa. Some jurisdictions, absolutely. Ghana's made some great progress, as have a number of other countries. And then Jordan, picking up on that, one of the circularities in this discussion and debate is it's not just about pulling stuff out of the ground, processing it and sending it off to market. What about bringing it back and recycling it and the opportunity to co-bundle? So would be interested in the industry view about whether this is just a straightforward mining opportunity or a co-bundling opportunity. So in quick succession, because I'm conscious of time, Terence, legal and regulatory framework. Jordan, what sort of opportunity is this?
Thanks, JP. I think obviously, as many speakers have said at this conference, the issue of ESGs, if you roll back 4 or 5 years ago, it was not even a topic that was spoken about. Now it's front of center. And what you find, if I talk about Botswana particularly, you find that if you look at the legal and regulatory framework, it is still at policy stage. I think they're still grappling with it at policy stage. For example, in Botswana, we've only just adopted in April the minerals policy, a finalized minerals policy. And you've got the energy policy as well, which is for 2020 up to 2040. So at this stage, it's not at the regulatory or legal framework, it's still at policy level. But the positive thing is in terms of the policy, there is a recognition. You can see that there's traces of issues that came out of the Paris Agreement from 2015. And if you look at the energy policy, it talks about the priorities. It's basically tailored on development, equity, and the environment. So throughout these documents, though it has not reached the regulatory framework, and in fact, the energy policy concedes that it is that the energy framework needs to, that the legal and regulatory framework needs to be strengthened. It does concede that it gives investors a level of confidence that is lacking at the moment because of the lack of it, speaking directly to your point. So that needs to be addressed in terms of now converting that into legal and regulatory bases. What you're finding is that I come from Botswana's, like South Africa, heavily coal endowed. And what you find is there is a lot of talk around the environment, and it's sprinkled all over these policies. But there is a level of protecting the coal environment. So what they talk about, and I see one of our colleagues from South Africa was talking yesterday, is the use of coal, but using technology, pushing the technology in terms of cleaner coal. And that is obviously a debate I see even in South Africa. It's a very big debate between, the Greens
and it's a very controversial one. It feeds into the question I posed at the beginning. And perhaps, John, what's your view? What is this opportunity looking like? Is it simply a straight mining opportunity? Is it a sustainable mining opportunity? Do you even out some of the bumps by co-bundling?
Yeah, look, just to be clear, I approach this from a mining operator perspective. But I think the most important thing to start with is that whether an operator is in the critical minerals game or not, it doesn't matter. All mining operations going forward need to be responsible and sustainable. And sustainable mining activity can take on different meanings, and we need to make sure that we're measuring the right things and we're measuring performance and articulating performance across industry honestly. Gone are the days where you can, place your ESG risk and opportunities as a second priority. And, I think we've all been pretty pleased with I've been in particular pretty pleased with what I've seen over the last couple of days in terms of ESG getting a seat at the table and getting mentioned by all these different companies. That said, I think that going forward, all mining operators who are starting up and going through the feasibility and project development stage, it's absolutely incumbent on all of us to explore the renewable energies for our power sources and power supply at an asset level. And obviously the business case for going to renewables needs to stack up, but at the same time, until we start looking at things like internal carbon pricing, then it may be too easy for us to say that renewables and the transition is not for us right now. So it's a very complex position that we find ourselves in. That said, I personally believe that all operators in the critical mineral space, they need to be advocates of the energy transition, and they need to be leading from the front, and the mining industry has a massive opportunity to play here to demonstrate that they're ready to walk the talk. And that advocacy will help to enable transition down the supply chain. All that said, I think one of the important things for all of us is that we need to take a balanced and considered approach to this transition. And so what I mean by that is we need to explore renewables and we need to adopt renewable energy wherever we can. But if we can't, then we need to be looking at things like setting emissions reduction targets at an asset level. We need to be looking to make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable for improved sustainability performance year on year. I think if we don't take a balanced and considered approach, then we run the risk of adversely impacting the energy transition timeframes. And I think that's something that we all agree, we need to be able to support at all costs.
I think we can all agree on that. And before I come to the question I posed at the beginning, it'll be interesting to see if we agree or disagree on the answer. Can I get a Mark who has a perspective? The African Australian Mining Association, different speeds of ESG in different places. We see this all around the world. Green isn't just green. You have light green, you have dark green. There are degrees of decarbonisation. There are different rates of progress. Mark, what do you think would be most effective in making a change to the perception of ESG in the mining industry, and particularly in the context of Africa?
All right, thank you very much, JP. The most important thing that I think as an industry we need to grasp is that ESG is crucial in mitigating associated risks with the business. And it's not different from your licenses to operate, because you're talking about the environment, you're talking about sustainability, you're talking about governance. All these are already inbuilt into your business, but it's more about grasping that and accepting that these are issues that need to be addressed. So in so doing, ESG gives us the opportunity to actually build it into our operating or business models. If we are upfront with ESG right from the operation, from startup, would have done our cost reviews, we will see what is sustainable and what is not profitable, so that when you present your business case, all these things has been considered. And also, whatever ESG initiatives that we're taking or making, it needs to be realistic. What we can do, because we just don't want to just make lip services to our commitment, but there's no deliverables. Where there are no deliverables, it becomes like just a buzzword. That's ESG. So what can the industry in Africa be able to, what is their appetite that they can take with regards to ESG compliances? And once those appetites have been defined and set, we put in the necessary measures and responsibilities to ensure that it is achieved. And with ESG, usually it is more of a corporate policy. But for ESG to be more sustainable, it needs the support and collaboration from government, because we're talking about ESG, which affects the environment in which those industries are operating. So what frameworks, what support from the executive, the judiciary, the legislative can also put across to support and enhance these ESG strategies? And finally, what I would like to also add is that with ESG, is something that all of us, it requires collaboration, it requires commitment, especially from the industries, and also leadership, both from government and also from the corporate bodies. Thank you.
Right. And so I think what I'm hearing there is leadership. Some examples, some success stories will show the way for others. And we've already heard some very good examples in this conference about collaboration that has produced some sustainable mining practices that can be applied elsewhere, some regulatory and legal changes in some countries that can be lifted and put into others. So it is all about collaboration. But I come back to the question I posed at the beginning. Mining transition critical minerals, not just any old mining, but the minerals we need to be able to transition. Is that something that we can afford to do sustainably or not? In other words, is there a case for arguing that we adopt an ESG best fit and do the best we can for now with transition critical minerals, using renewable energy when it's available and striving to make it more sustainable as we go? Or do we have to make sure that it's sustainable from the outset? Conscious of time, we've run a bit over, so I'm going to skip through all the speakers very quickly for a view on that. Honourable Minister, yes or no?
Well, thank you very much. If you allow me, just let me say that one of the important matters we have to keep our minds on is always the effort to make the transition between the targets, the objectives, and how to get there. I mean, I was at COP26 in Glasgow, and I've been a student of the discussions on climate change, ESGs, and the rest. But the gulf between the targets, the objectives, and getting the deliverables has always been the big issue. Yes. I think that it's important that as we talk about these things, we also avert our minds to that. The green transition is very important. There's absolutely no two ways about it. I think that there is some sense of unanimity in the scientific community that is really the way forward. That is where we should head towards in terms of breaking the impact of fossil fuel and therefore begin to get an automobile industry which will not emit carbon and also contribute to the fight against climate change. Now, I just want to make one quick final point, which is that we also have to appreciate the various levels of development of this whole industry. I mean, for example, in my country, Ghana, we are still even at the stage of exploration when it comes to the ingredients required to produce these batteries, let alone to produce electric vehicles. Yes. So I think we should be mindful of that. Whereas the other places like in Australia, in Europe, and in America, and several other places, there is even the talk that by 2030, 2050 or so, fossil fuel powered vehicles will be out of the system altogether. So it requires a global effort, and that global effort must take into account the various levels of development of these green minerals. My biggest concern as minister responsible for mining in Ghana is how I'm going to attract the investment into this area and the investment into the area which will be mutually beneficial to the investors and the country. Beginning with exploration, so a bit of it is happening in Ghana, as I said, and then we have to get to mining, and then we have to get to the highest end of the value chain, which is the downstream industry, before we get to the electric vehicles and so on and so forth. But suffice for me to conclude by stating and doing so emphatically that we are fully, the government of Ghana is fully committed to the green transition, and we've been putting in place all the major components which are required to unleash this industry. It is going to help our economy in tremendous ways. It's going to contribute to the global fight against climate change, and we are fully committed to that. Thank you.
Jordan, what's your view?
Short, sharp. I believe we need to take a balanced and considered approach here. I think the mining industry needs to capitalise on the opportunity to be early adopters of all renewable energy and renewable technology. And we need to genuinely and credibly explore the business case for doing so wherever we can. If we are unable to implement renewable technologies right now to power mining operations, then we need to be doing everything else we can, such as setting emissions reduction targets and pursuing high performance across the whole ESG paradigm in a way to offset that, whilst continually exploring our options in terms of moving away from fossil fuels.
Right, so I think Ghana says we need to go green, green, green and push it, and you're making great progress. Jordan's saying the view from industry is we do our best, and if we are not quite there, we get started and we improve as we go, but we really need to improve. You can't just throw the ESG book out the window.
Do you shut down mines? Do you shut down mines that use diesel generation?
Right.
Diesel generated electricity, right?
And flick the switch.
Yeah. Do you shut them down now, or do you have a credible plan in place to reduce your emissions and to explore alternative and renewable energies? Absolutely, that's my view.
Terence?
I agree with him 100%, but I think what's also important, ultimately all of this depends on economics. We need to have a transition, and like you say, you can't just switch it off. But what you find encouraging is that when you look even at a very basic level, for example, in rural areas, farmers, right? Farmers, when we grew up, farmers were using diesel. That's how you powered your pumps for water, to water your animals. Right now, farmers are now moving to solar, right? And I can assure you that most of them are not doing it because of the environment, but because of economics. So we have to put that at the base of where
economics
we are.
and technology.
Economics and technology, those are the two that are combining. So as long as we look at that in an equitable way, then it'll work. If not, African countries are going to rebel.
So I think what you're saying is if the market makes it work, we do it.
Precisely.
Mark, very quickly, and then I'm going to finish with Hubert because we're out of time.
For me, what I think what we can also do is definitely we mining engineers or in the professionals, we have a credo that says that if it cannot be grown, it has to be mined. So with all these critical materials that we're talking about, it's going to be mined eventually. But how do we do it responsibly? How do we do it sustainably? So for us as professionals, is to adopt the innovative technologies to make it safer and sustainable, and also incorporate best practices in our operation. And in doing so, I believe we will have a much more cleaner environment as we all desire. Thanks.
We will, and if it's going to be mined anyway, you've got a choice. You either mine it sustainably or you don't, and if you don't, it'll have embedded emissions in it, and at some point, your end user is going to have to pay a tax on it, and they're going to pass that on to you, or they're not going to buy your product, and they're going to go to someone else who can mine it more sustainably. Last word on this, Hubert.
I think, well, from an ESG perspective, as asset owners and institutional investors, we see E effectively as the net present value of S. You know, that's really where we sit. So, you know, our primary focus is really to decarbonize our portfolios so our decarbonized portfolios can green the real economy. So we really want to just focus on mobilizing capital at scale through institutional investor-public partnerships with governments to be able to bring affordable renewable energy solutions for the mining industry to be able to accelerate that process. And, you know, according to the African Union position, it's probably going to be a little olive for a while, for a predictable while, but we're all focused on delivering the green. Thank you.
Thank you to our panellists, to the Right Honourable Minister, and to our esteemed panellist guests. Can I leave you with one thought? COP27 is around the corner. This is your opportunity to make your voices heard. Transition critical minerals are important to the whole world. Without them, none of us can transition, and we need to come to a solution. You have more of them than just about anyone. The solution lies in your hands. There are lots of challenges, but by golly, the opportunities are huge. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening. Wish you a pleasant lunch.